Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another episode of Radio MMT. How are you, Anne?
Hello, Kevin, and hello to our lovely listener, who I know just loves hanging out with us while we talk macroeconomics.
This week we have an interview with Alan Kohler.
Alan Kohler, that's like a scoop for us.
Yeah, it's interesting speaking to Alan because he's one of the more progressive commentators on mainstream television and media, and it's very hard to find mainstream economic commentators who have some sort of appreciation for MMT, and Alan appears to be one of those commentators. So it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, he's very unique in that respect. You know, that puts him in the open-minded category for me.
So rather than just start talking economics, I thought we'd try and get a bit of background on Alan and see how he started off and where he started forming his ideas. So I started the conversation just with asking Alan where it all began.
You're listening to Radical Radio 3CR.
Okay, so this week we are speaking with Alan Kohler, who I'm trying to figure out the best way to describe you. Alan, are you a financial journalist, or are you somebody who's involved with investment services?
I'm a journalist. One of the things I do is I write for a publication called Eureka Report, which I actually started in 2005 and is now owned by a investment company called Invest Smart. But I'm not really involved in the rest of its operations, just in Eureka Report, which I started but I don't own anymore. So that's the story about that. But I'm not an investment advisor, I'm a journalist.
And something which I've also, whilst doing some research on you, has found out that you're not an economist. You're not trained as an economist. You started as a journalist with the Australian back in 1969, I believe.
Correct.
And from there, you've essentially built a knowledge of the broader economy over the 50 years that you've been a journalist.
That's right. Doing a lot of reading and talking to people and watching. I'm not saying that my approach is preferable. Sometimes I wish that I had gone to university and I had studied economics, because that would have given me a better grounding, I guess, in some of the history of it. But look, I've done a lot of reading, and I think I'm more or less up to speed.
I tapped into an interview you did with Radio National, which was called The Year That Made Me, and you nominated 1978 as the year that made you. But I was interested in your journey because you started as a cadet with the Australian, then found yourself in Darwin around Cyclone Tracy time.
Yes, well, after I finished my cadetship, which was 4 years, I decided to quit and leave and do some travel, and I hitchhiked to Darwin. And that was 1974. So the beginning of 1974, I ended up in Darwin, and I lived up there working for the Northern Territory News as a court reporter for 12 months. And I was there when Tracy hit on Christmas Eve in 1974. So that was quite an experience.
That must have been quite an experience.
Sure, it was. That's right. Well, the house, like every other house in Darwin, our house was blown down. And so, look, I was able to come home. Well, I did come home to Melbourne after that. After that, and because the government was paying for people who didn't come from Darwin to go back to where they came from if they wanted to. So I said, right, I'll do that.
Okay, but I also noticed that you've got a stint there where you went to Perth, and there's a number of combi vans involved in this journey, because you mentioned that you had 3 combi vans, and you lived over in Perth for a little while as well.
I did live in Perth, and worked for the ABC, and also a newspaper called the National Miner, which was owned by Lang Hancock, and had a few combi vans, not just in Perth but here in Melbourne. And when I was living with a group of Kiwis in Perth, and we built a 42-foot steel yacht.
Wow. Okay.
And the plan was to keep going from Perth across the Indian Ocean. And we actually completed the yacht, but I didn't think I wanted to do that. And then once we finished the yacht,
was there a little bit of doubt in the seaworthiness of the yacht, or?
No, it was a beauty. It was fine. Yeah. And in fact, I kind of left and came back to Melbourne. Left the other guys to it, but they sailed it to Adelaide.
Okay.
And one of the guys lived on it in Adelaide for a while. And then he sold it.
So what was Perth like in the mid-70s? I've got visions of the Leaderville Arms Hotel, the Shenton Park Hotel. We've got Dave Warner doing his boy from the suburbs thing. He's just a suburban boy. Was that pretty much the environment over there?
It was pretty wild. Yeah, it was great. It was a good place to be for a while. Sure, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and to be honest, I did enjoy getting to know Lang Hancock a bit too. He was.
Oh, okay, rightio.
He was a crazy guy.
Now, I am interested in the combi vans. Anybody I know who's owned more than one combi van is a bit of a fan of combi vans. What was your favourite combi van out of the 3 that you had?
Probably the first one, which was blue, and it was hotted up a bit, and it had a racing steering wheel. It was a ripper.
Is this the classic blue and white combi van with the split windscreen?
No, it was actually fully blue. I did have one of those green and white ones. That's a very typical combi van. Green around the bottom and white on top.
Split windscreen?
No, the first one was, but the second and thirds were not. I'm
speaking about this with some heritage myself. I was born in 1962 into an Alpine Tourer 1962 combi van with the canvas roof and the oval windows, and that was how I was raised for the first 15 years of my life, travelling around that thing. So, I was interested to see how you went yourself.
No, I can't say that I didn't live in it for 15 years. I did drive it around the country.
3CR, here to stay.
Suburban boy. Saturday night, no subway stations. Saturday night, just changing TV stations. I'm just a suburban boy. Just a suburban boy. And I know what it's like to be rejected every night. And I'm sure that it must be easier for boys from the city. Suburban boy. Sunday session, I'm down at the hotel, staring at girls that I don't know. Well, I'm just a suburban boy. I'm just a suburban boy. And I know what it's like to be rejected every night. And I'm sure that it must be easier for boys from the city. Saturday night, no subway stations. Saturday night, just changing TV stations. I'm just a suburban boy, just a suburban boy, and I know what it's like. I've been rejected every night, and I'm sure that it must be easier for boys from the city.
Here on 3CR, this is Radio MMT with Anne and Kev. We've been speaking with Alan Kohler, who spent time in Perth during the 1970s, so I thought I'd play that track, Just a Suburban Boy by Dave Warner, who was in fact over in Perth during the 70s. Anyway, let's continue our interview with Alan Kohler. We're back in Melbourne, September 77. You're back at the Australian, which is where you originally started off at?
I was.
And then shortly after that, you're off to England.
Well, yeah. So I got back to Melbourne, got a job back on the Australian, fell in love with a woman who was on the Australian, but she was leaving and she had a ticket for London. So I sold my combi and for $1,000, I think, and bought a ticket to London to go with her.
That is true love. Anybody who's has to make a choice between the combi van and the girl, you chose the girl.
I did. So I sold the combi. That was my last combi, and yeah. Well, anyway, we're still married 44 years later.
Well, that's excellent. A lot of younger guys might have made bad choices, but sounds like you made the right decision.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, we got 3 great kids, and none of them have combis. Which is probably just as well because they're not very safe cars, let's face it.
No, they're not. Actually, don't go very well. You're over to England. You've married Deb Forster.
So she's a novelist. Anyway, so we got married in Exeter, in Devon, and our honeymoon consisted of riding our bicycles to Greece.
That's a fair ride.
It was it took a couple of months.
Good test of a relationship.
Yeah, that's right. And that's right. We camped on the side of the road in a 2-man tent.
It's not what you call a flash extravagant honeymoon.
Well, no, the wedding was basically at the registry office with 2 sub-editors from the Exeter Express and Echo as our witnesses. So we were not, there wasn't the sort of wedding my children have had.
But it stood the test of time, so that's a very nice thing to see. 1978, you come back to Melbourne and you start work at The Age. And shortly after, you're working at the Financial Review. You become the editor of the Financial Review during the Hawke and Keating years. That would have been an interesting time.
It was very interesting.
This is where you might have developed something of an understanding of how the system can change and how it operates.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, obviously, one of the first things Hawke and Keating did was to float the dollar. I don't think any of us thought, crikey, you can float the thing, So we kind of, that was, look, it was both exciting and highly educational, the whole process that Hawke and Keating were undertaking to reform the economy and to open it up to the world. And, there was just so much going on at the time, which continued really, let's face it, right through until Keating lost in 96. And you've got to say it didn't sort of slow down then. I mean, I kind of, I was editor of The Age for 3 years. In 95 went to the ABC on the 7:30 report. 98 spent some months reporting on the great waterfront dispute, which was also exciting and educational. So that and so the things that Howard and Costello were doing was almost in many ways as interesting as what Hawke and Keating did, in a different kind of way. Though when they were not opening up the economy in the way that the Labor guys were, but it was still really kind of interesting and educational. So when you're a reporter and you've been doing it and you do it for sort of a few decades, you tend to pick up a few things.
Well, of course, this is the era when that interests us as MMTers in modern monetary theory is the fiat currency, floating the dollar. It changes a lot of dynamics, and it appears that a lot of orthodox economists don't understand the significance of floating the dollar and the impact that it has on how governments can view their ability to operate within the economy. So at the same time that we've got a fiat currency being introduced, we're also seeing an ideology of neoliberalism overtaking economic management as well. I'm interested to see how you feel about the ability of the government currently to intervene in the economy, given that it's been a very monetarist ideology that we've been operating under for about the last 30 or 40 years.
What I think is that neoliberalism, which, as you say, sort of overtook the world in about 1980 through the 80s, and in those days it was called economic rationalism, which all the lefties were accusing Keating and Hawke of bringing about. So, but they weren't the key drivers of what was called economic rationalism. That was obviously Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and that was a backlash essentially against the New Deal of Franklin D. Roosevelt from the 30s and Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and so that sort of the pendulum swung back towards small government, I guess you'd have to say, and really, that kind of idea of that government, as Ronald Reagan put it, is the problem, not the solution, has kind of been it's been the kind of overriding philosophy of economic management really since then. And what occurred, what's happened, it seems to me, is that it's entered the sort of the bones of everybody that fiscal policy is not it's not something that should be used to control the economy. And in some ways, I can see that because nobody really trusts politicians these days, and there's some basis for that. So the idea that you'd allow politicians to control the economy is, a bit anathema. So what happened in the 90s was that firstly central banks were made independent, and basically economic management was handed over to them, which is, in a sense, understandable. It means that, in a way, government has been divided between political and technocratic. So you've got the economic government of the world, in a sense, is a technocracy, if I can put it that way, controlled by economists who run the central banks. And that's where we are at the moment, and have been for a while. That economic management is the province of economic technocrats, which I must say, look, I mean, I understand modern monetary theory pretty well. I've spent a lot of time with Bill Mitchell, who was one of the founders of it. I've interviewed Walter Mosler, who was part of it with Bill. I have lunch with Bill pretty regularly, and I kind of I get it. But the trouble with modern monetary theory is that it relies on having to let politicians to control the amount of money around. So, and I don't really want to do that.
This is the concept behind a balanced budget, which is that governments can't spend any more than they receive in tax revenue, and if they do, they issue bonds as a form of restraint, pretty much on government spending too much. We've got these economic theories about how to manage the economy, and the situation we find ourselves in currently is that the only instrument used to try and bring inflation down that's being relied upon is the Reserve Bank to use interest rates. And that's being used on this basis that there's too much money in the economy, that it needs to be constrained. The only effective way to do that is via interest rates. Do you think that the government spending during the pandemic has contributed to the current episode of inflation?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, let's go back a step. Firstly, there is no balanced budget. There hasn't been a balanced budget for forever. I mean, very occasionally that goes into surplus, but really the most budgets around the world are in deficit all the time. So in some ways, most governments, if not all governments, are adherents of modern monetary theory because deficits don't matter. But they do kind of pay lip service to a balanced budget, but they don't actually do it. Look, I remember, as you do, I'm sure, what it was like in March and April and June of 2020 when nobody knew what the hell was going on, and we were all kind of staring over the abyss, what we thought was the abyss of economic collapse, as everyone shut down. And I think, with the benefit of hindsight, there's no doubt that the governments went overboard with the amount of fiscal stimulus that they did, and also the central banks went overboard, cutting interest rates to zero, in Australia 0.1%, and printing money, and everyone's just doing anything and everything in order to rescue the economy, which everyone thought at the time was going to be another Great Depression. It turned out that wasn't the case. That the economies turned out to be much more resilient than expected. And so what's happened as a result of that is quite a big pulse of inflation coming out of it. That's true. And the other thing that's true, in my view, and I think it's it's demonstrable, is that monetary policy is a very imperfect tool to deal with inflation. I mean, what you're doing is you're putting up interest rates so that affects borrowers, and not just all borrowers, but the least well-off borrowers. Monetary policy, in that sense, is a tax on the poor. So you're using the poor as the kind of shock troops in the battle against inflation. And there's no doubt that the better way to do it would be, say, for example, to put up GST or to increase taxes generally, because that would affect everybody, not just borrowers. But that's not going to happen because politicians do not want to put up taxes and won't do it. That's why they made central banks independent, in order to give themselves cover and to ensure that they don't have to do anything nasty. I mean, obviously, politicians and governments will reduce taxes at the drop of a hat. Are happy to spend more money and are happy to stimulate the economy, as they did during the GFC. And in fact, as we've discussed, they went overboard. So that's something politicians love doing. What they don't love doing and will not do is to take it away. So central banks have been deputized to take it away.
So when you say that they went overboard on the spending during the lockdown, are you thinking about simply the size of the spending, the quantity of dollars, or are you thinking about where the spending went, as in how they targeted the spending?
Oh, a bit of both, really. I mean, it was mainly the amount. I think, look, the Australian system of JobKeeper, where they gave the money to governments, to companies, in order for them to keep people employed, I think was a good idea. But they were insufficiently rigorous about how they gave that out. They didn't get the money back. So tons of companies got money that they didn't need because they weren't going to sack people anyway. A lot of the retailers, in particular, found themselves, doing fantastic business from online shopping. People didn't stop shopping; they just did it online, and all the retailers did fantastic business. So they were fine, and they didn't need that money, but a lot of them kept it. So a lot of that money just went to places it wasn't meant to, or wasn't needed. And so what we've got now is a tremendous amount of savings in households. So we've got this kind of bit of a paradox in a way. If you look at the aggregate ABS data, you'll see that the amount of household savings is extremely high. But because of the 12 rate hikes we've already had, there's a tremendous amount of distress as well. So you've got this kind of barbell situation where, on the one hand, there's a huge amount of savings and a lot of people are swimming in money. And on the other hand, at the other end of the scale, there's tons of people who are lining up at food bank to get by. And I think this is, in a sense, an extreme example of what monetary policy does, which is to increase inequality, because the people who have got savings do well out of interest rates going up. The people who don't have savings and have large borrowings do really badly. And so monetary policy tends to increase inequality. The tax system, on the other hand, is designed, particularly the income tax system, is designed to be progressive. That is to say, there's a higher percentage for people who are well off than those who are not well off. So, clearly a better way to go would be to increase income taxes temporarily, if you could do it. I mean, so that the people who are well off, in an ideal world, people who are well off, paid more than those who were not. But as I say, that's simply out of the question. I mean, and not that it was ever in the question, in the sense that there was ever a time when governments used taxes to manipulate the economy and manipulate demand in the way that interest rates currently do. It's not as if that was ever done. Politicians have always been more inclined to reduce taxes and to increase spending rather than do the reverse.
Maybe they should hand the responsibility of the taxation over to the RBA as well, if that's.
Oh dear.
No, well, seriously, there's actually a serious side to that, which is that an economist I know called Nicholas Gruen once proposed that fiscal policy, or at least taxation policy, be handed over to an independent body like the Reserve Bank, who could, within a band, change taxes according to the economic needs of the time. So it wouldn't be a political decision, but they could, say, increase taxes by 5% or reduce taxes by 5% across the board as an independent statutory body. So, yeah, I mean, you could theoretically do that.
3CR.
You're on Radio MMT with Anne and Kev. We recently interviewed Alan Kohler. I think speaking to Alan, I'd watched him during COVID, and he'd done a previous interview with Bill Mitchell, so he seemed to be fairly up to speed with MMT, and I had high expectations of the conversation. I must say he met some of my expectations, but not all of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kevin, I am going to have to take both you and Alan to task here.
Sure. Two over-opinionated middle-aged white guys espousing their views upon the world, yes.
Well, when I listened back to our conversation with Alan, and it was that part where you and Alan were talking about having technocrats, not politicians, determine tax policy or have a say in tax policy. And I have to say, I think that is a horrible neoliberal idea.
Well, yeah. Look, I'm not disagreeing with that. I think a part of the conversation that we had with Alan, he's a guy with 50 years' experience, and I was trying to listen as much as possible, but I didn't agree with everything he said. And and certainly, I think we've had other conversations where, when it comes to things where you have bureaucrats and technocrats making decisions on behalf of populations, and they're not elected. And this goes to the heart of what a lot of Bill Mitchell says about the Eurozone, is that you've got these bodies of people making decisions that affects the everyday lives of millions of people, and they're not elected. There needs to be some sort of accountability. So don't hold me to what Alan said. I was just listening at the time.
No, you weren't. Well, you made the suggestion that we could have technocrats doing taxation.
I was being compliant. I was trying to be polite and nice.
Yes, I was being polite too, actually. And now, when I look back to it, I agree with you that we've got the Eurozone as an example of technocracy gone terribly wrong. We both know that the Eurozone is a basket case when it comes to their monetary policy.
Well, this reflects directly to Philip Lowe and the RBA, who are supposed to have independence. And the suggestion was, and this actually comes from a history of where the states used to have income tax powers and regimes, and they handed them over to the federal government because no government wants to be responsible for collecting taxes. It's very unpopular. So the further you can distance yourself from that, the more popular you can become as a political entity. We need people who are held accountable, but they don't want to be held accountable. And so you've got this conflict going on. It's very hard to try and find a reasonable balance for that.
I'm glad to find we are in agreement, because I was thinking, oh no, Kevin's gone down a very strange byway here.
No. I'm not absolutely not.
Because it is one thing, to hand technical decisions to technical experts, but it's a whole other thing to hand political decisions to so-called technical experts.
Yes, I think we're in agreement on that, Anne. Look, let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and continue our interview with Alan Kohler. You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
You're on Radio MMT with Anne and Kev. That was Jade Imagine with the song Walking Around. Now, before the break, we were interviewing Alan Kohler, and I'd asked him about the impact that government spending during COVID had on inflation. He was fairly adamant that it had significantly contributed to the current inflation episode. We take up the conversation where I challenge that premise. So you said before that that the COVID spending by the government has contributed significantly to the current inflation episode. I would question that to some degree. The causes of inflation, even Philip Lowe lists them as the external supply side problems with oil prices going up, supply side problems with COVID, even things like trees burning down during the bushfires, etc., have pushed the price of these supplies up a lot of the time through price gouging, and that these are the main causes of inflation, and that the extra money around from COVID, for instance, which was provided by the coalition government, in many respects has been a bit of an antidote to the private debt that was realised during the Howard Costello years, where household debt maxed out because we're running surpluses, we'd say, from our perspective, and that the coalition's spending during COVID might have helped relieve some of that high household debt, and that the real causes of inflation, as I said before, are from supply side issues. In which case, as you're saying, raising interest rates, which is only affecting people with loans, so it doesn't affect the entire population. It only affects those, especially the more vulnerable, small business with who are highly geared, or new home buyers who already have mortgages, etc., who are already been affected by inflation with higher petrol prices, etc. I would question the assumption that the spending of the government during COVID was a significant contributor to inflation.
It was clearly both. Clearly, there were a lot of supply side problems, and during the pandemic, prices went up a lot, particularly after Russia invaded Ukraine. But oil prices have been declining for 12 months, and the supply chain pressures have gone away. They don't exist anymore, haven't really existed for at least 6 months. So there's no doubt that part of the inflation, part of the reason that there's an inflation is the increase in demand resulting from the money. I mean, I'm not saying that it's the main thing, although it might be, but it's certainly part of the story.
But inflation is coming down as we speak.
Yeah, inflation. That's right.
As the supply side issues become resolved, we are seeing inflation coming down, and it might be coming down completely independently of the interest rate rises.
Well, it's definitely coming down, and I think it probably is coming down independently of the interest rate increases, because monetary policy supposedly acts with a 12-month lag. So, you know, the interest rate increases began in May 2022. So 12-month lag would put us in around about now. So look, and inflation's been coming down on a monthly basis since November. So yeah, I mean, I think the Reserve Bank's gone too far. I think that at least one rate hike too many. So, you know, I'm in furious agreement with you.
Could I just reflect on something I think I'm hearing you say, Alan, which is that you're not particularly in disagreement about the MMT description of the plumbing of the economy and its description of fiscal and monetary policy and how the two interact, and the role, say, of the central bank. But you do have some concern about, it seems to come down to how we can trust the politicians to manage all that plumbing, and some concern about the sorts of institutional arrangements we would have to reflect that. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me like the mainstream or even the public understanding of this plumbing, which is what MMT talks about, is very distorted. And I just wonder how you feel about the public being educated about the, the possibilities of fiscal spending and the possibilities of the public purse and, all these sorts of things that Kevin and I often talk about on the show.
MMT should be seen as a description rather than a prescription, if I can put it that way. MMT is an accurate description of the way the economy works and the way governments work. And of course, it's the case that that the Reserve Bank creates money all the time. When the government wants to pay a bill, it tells the Reserve Bank to pay the bill. And the Reserve Bank pays the bill whether there's money in the account or not, and it can and does do that. So, look, I mean, I think as a description of the way the world works, MMT is fine, but it's only when it's taken to be a prescription that, governments should simply create money to deal with spending, I think is problematic. Governments should not be in a position or allowed to create money to finance their spending. That's basically what I think.
But that's essentially what they've always done, though. And we see this exemplified in extreme circumstances like World War II, the GFC, the recent pandemic. Governments need to be able to apply fiscal solutions to the problems at hand, and they choose to do it, or they have to do it during moments of crisis. It's just that they seem to pull right back when they don't identify something as a crisis. They say we can't afford this and we can't afford that. Should we be scared of deficits? I mean, the issue, as I see it, is that government spending should be more concerned with the inflationary effects or the well-being effects that occur when it spends, and should disregard deficits because we run continuous deficits and we always have.
Yeah, so the MMT teaches us that the only thing that will limit the amount of government spending is inflation, not the amount of money that the government has, and to that extent, deficits don't matter. So that's fine. I agree with that. But the thing is that deficits can and do cause inflation. So that needs to be borne in mind. That's all. You just need to keep an eye on it and don't let it happen.
All spending can cause inflation.
Spending in itself is not inflationary. It depends where it's applied. So if you apply government spending in an area where there are constrained resources, you'll push the price up. But if you apply spending to areas where it's genuinely needed, like apparently we need submarines, that's not going to be inflationary. Is it more a case of the focus that's on deficits is overstated and the emphasis on the real effects is not really taken into proper consideration?
Well, it has to do with the resources in the economy and the ability of the economy to supply whatever the spending is directed towards. So if the spending is applied to something that's in limited supply, then it'll force up prices and inflation. If the spending is kind of general, as I believe what's happened, during the GFC, lots of people got extra money, and the spending was across the board. That's had some impact on pushing prices up. We can argue about whether it's the main thing, but it certainly, in my view, had some impact on putting prices up because it has led to increased spending. But I've written in the past, and I'll probably have another crack at it soon, that I don't think governments have any idea how much dealing with climate change is going to cost, both financing the transition to renewable energy and also dealing with the impact of climate change, which is going to be colossally expensive. I've suggested that dealing with climate change should be a matter for the Reserve Bank to create money. It's possible, I suppose, you could just run deficits. The trouble is that we're still in this mindset that deficits are bad, and the government might be inclined to try to offset the spending on climate change with taxes or spending cuts elsewhere, which I think would be a bad idea. There is a case for saying that the money to deal with climate change needs to be actually manifested out of thin air, because where else are we going to get it from? The amount of money needed is beyond anything that anyone, I think, at this point understands.
That was going to be my next question, and if we regarded the COVID pandemic as an emergency crisis that needed a fiscal response, do you think that part of our history might help in changing the attitudes of orthodox economists about how governments should be spending on environmental measures in the future? Or do you think that the environment is a different sort of crisis because of its gradual nature that it won't be recognised?
The global temperature seems to have gone past the Paris target of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Now that's already happened. So things are already getting pretty difficult and uncomfortable. If and when the temperature rises to 2 degrees and beyond, 2.5 degrees beyond pre-industrial temperatures, then things are going to be really, really bad. And so I think that at some point the governments will be looking for the panic button. And it's an interesting question as to what does the panic button look like for climate change, because there's going to be, I think, at some point there's going to be a crikey, what are we going to do now moment when everyone realises that we're in the poo. Yes, it's up to this point it's been gradual. I mean, they've been meeting once a year since Kyoto in 1997. They all signed up to the Kyoto protocols and didn't mean it. I mean, nothing's happened really. Emissions have continued to rise. And even, the last year's Conference of the Parties in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, didn't do anything, I mean, this year they're going to meet in, I think, Abu Dhabi, and Abu Dhabi's appointed some oil executive to be the chairman of the conference this year. We're still not there, right? The floods that we had last year in Lismore and everything, that's going to happen again. And this year we've got an El Nino. There's going to be it's going to be blazing hot this summer in Australia. There's going to be a lot of fires. Is that going to be the time for panic button? I don't know. I mean, I think we're getting to the point now where something drastic will have to be done, and whatever it's done is going to be expensive. People can't get insured anymore. All the people living in the floodplains of Australia can't get insurance, so they're going to have to be, when they get flooded, they're going to have to be bailed out and or moved to higher ground. So that's going to cost many billions of dollars. There's a couple of million. I think there's a couple of million people live in floodplains in Australia. They're going to get washed away. And there's a whole lot of people living in forests. They're going to get burnt down. Low-lying countries, this is possibly the biggest problem. I mean, a lot of countries are going to be inundated. So there'll be probably hundreds of millions of refugees at some point. So they're going to have to be looked after. So the cost of switching to renewable energy is enormous enough as it in itself. How are we going to make concrete and steel? It's not just electric vehicles and all that stuff, but it's, just basic things of life are going to be expensive. Dealing with the consequences of climate change are also going to be enormously expensive. So the deficits, the government deficits from climate change are going to be epic, if I can put it that way.
This is Bill Mitchell. You're listening to my favourite Melbourne radio station, 3CR, with Anne and Kev. Great program, great guests.
You're listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev. We've just been listening to Alan Kohler for the most of this show, and he's been vacillating between two positions. He was talking about the impending environmental disaster and how we need to have large government spending to mitigate that disaster. Yet earlier in the show, he was saying that he's quite sceptical of how involved the government should become in spending, which to me sounded like a fairly conservative point of view.
Yeah, we'd like to see the government spending more. But remember what we were saying about the budget, which is a lot of the budget isn't discretionary, which means a lot of the spending that happens during the year, and I think it's the majority. So even on the monetary base, the immediate political decisions are not affecting the monetary base as much as some people might think.
Yeah, if unemployment goes up, that goes up automatically. You don't need a new government policy to decide that they're going to pay unemployment benefits to more people, or if your population ages and more of them are on the pension, these things happen automatically. So what you're saying is correct.
Yeah, but the discretionary decision around that might be that you would raise the pay rate of job seeker, and therefore you would actually increase the spending.
Yeah, and I think the reason that there's not much government involvement in the dynamics of the economy is because that's been whittled down under neoliberal ideology for them to stay out of the economy. I think you and I would agree that the government should become far more involved in the economy than they are.
So in a funny way, we kind of agree with what Alan was saying, which is that governments have been sidelined out of the economy since the 1980s and 90s, and we'd like to see them have more involvement, and Alan seems to want them to have less involvement.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused by what he's saying, because on the one hand he's saying that there needs to be a massive injection of money from the RBA to deal with climate change, but he's sort of saying that should be made outside of government decisions, and I don't know how you organise that, because the RBA is the government's bank, and as he also said earlier, they pay the bills on instruction from the government, and so if the government instructs them to pay for something, then that's what they do. That's their job, is the RBA. So I don't know. It confused me. It's a bit each way. On the one hand, he doesn't want government to become. It doesn't trust government to become involved in big spending decisions. But on the other hand, that's what they're supposed to do. That's their job, and he seems to recognise that.
Well, maybe some of the confusion might be where I felt like I heard him say that the Reserve Bank should be creating this money for this intervention regarding the climate crisis and all the other crises. But the government should be creating money through deficits. It should be the Reserve Bank creating money. And of course, we think that that's the same diff.
Yeah, I mean, the Reserve Bank is the government's bank. So who makes that decision on how to spend it? Do we have unelected Reserve Bank officials deciding that they're going to spend this amount of money on mitigating climate change, or do we have elected representatives? There's a good case for both when you think about it. If you had an effective public service,
you're going down the technocracy track again.
Let's just have a look at it, see if it could possibly work.
Okay.
If you had a public service like the CSIRO were the body who were responsible for directing policy on climate change, and we're talking about the CSIRO of the olden days, where they were actually scientists doing good science, and they were a trusted body. If they were advising the RBA, if they had some sort of mandate to advise the RBA on where to spend money, public money, to mitigate the effects of climate change, I'd be pretty happy with that. I'd certainly be more happy with the CSIRO doing that than I would with Peter Dutton doing that. But that's in a perfect world, and it just depends on how you structure that. We have things like Infrastructure Australia that advises government on the priorities of where they should be spending on developing roads and bridges and infrastructure. If you could have a trusted body to do that, then I would kind of agree with Alan. But if you don't, if you've got a good government, let's say the Greens were holding the balance of power, they were heavily influencing Labor in their policy, and they were advising government expenditure on climate change, I'd be happy with that as well. So I don't know, how does it work?
In a way, you're saying the same thing as me, because when I say, the government should be spending whatever it needs to on adapting for climate change, I'm imagining some kind of Department of Biocapacity, which has almost an open wallet. You're not creating new arrangements between the central bank and the public service. What you're doing is having Parliament say to the public service, have at it, So you would be, funding your emergency services in the case of bushfires and floods and so on. You would be funding the CSIRO to do its research on whatever kinds of technology we need. And I think all that can happen within the kinds of institutional structures we have that are overseen by an elected body we call the Parliament.
Yes, I guess, and what you're talking about there is trusting government and trusting the public service two institutions which are not held in high regard in the current times. Hey, but look, Anne, plenty of food for thought here. We're going to have some more interview with Alan in the near future, but we've got to make way because Mafalda's coming up next with Vicky. So see you in a couple of weeks.
See you then, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational
I
expectations.
think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get musical.
We're going to do the regression theory of money to music.
That will work. That's good. Regression theory of money. What rhymes with regression? Regression, suppression, there's a world of opportunity here. This has got legs. This is going to work. Bill's going to